Hello and welcome to Alita Dogma Shades of Murder, a podcast where I will share and discuss tales of true crime, mysteries, and all things dark and macabre. If you eat, play, and dream in shades of murder like me, then welcome, my kindred spirits, to your new podcast home. If you enjoy this show, please remember to follow and subscribe, share, and rate, so I can present more stories to you, and we can all embrace the allure of the darkness together. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case, and may not be intended for all audiences. Nothing makes me happier than this time of the year. With the leaves on the cusp of change and the crisp, chilly air in the night, I welcome and embrace all elements of fall. I have the most wonderful and vivid memories of Halloween from the time I was a toddler to the present day. The season of witches, vampires, and ghosts is here. This will be the first of 3 Halloween-inspired episodes. There are houses where murders have taken place all around the world. There are murders that have been reported and become a part of its mystery, fear, and allure, and those that just feel like they hold darkness within their walls. Some stories and places are infamous, like Lizzie Borden's or the Amityville Horror House, and there are others that may not have been turned into a film or a novel, nor are they at the forefront of true crime shows and podcasts. There are houses that have become historic centerpieces of towns, known for their beautiful architecture and elaborate design, and the family legacy that was built. Some may not even realize as they tour the estate or hold a grand wedding on its grounds, the macabre history of the place. This is the story of the Glensheen mansion murders. Led by patriarch Chester A. Congdon, the Congdon family established a lavish legacy through investment in the mining industry at the end of the 19th century in Duluth, Minnesota. Chester Congdon had an impressive background as an attorney, businessman, and state legislator. Along with his wife Clara, they built an elaborate and beautiful English manor on the shores of Lake Superior in the first decade of the 20th century. Sitting on 12 acres of land, the estate had its own gardens and bridges, in addition to 22 acres of lakefront property. Being that the area was barely developed at this time, it was overrun by trees, which the Congdons preserved and incorporated as much as possible into the exterior and interior design of their estate. They were also concerned with having their home be self-sufficient, so they had plans created for a greenhouse, an orchard, a vegetable garden, a barn for cows, and a water reservoir. There was also a carriage house and stables, a boathouse, tennis courts, and a pool, in addition to a gardener's cottage and living quarters for their employees. The 5-story, 39-room mansion encompassed 27,000 square feet of living space. It showcased the finest in craftsmanship and design, featuring a sprawling, ornately carved wooden staircase. The mansion had its own quaint and charming sunroom, an elegant and inviting library, a decadent dining hall, and a spectacular terrace that led down to the pool. During the time of its construction between 1905 and 1908, the Congdons spent $854,000, which today has a purchasing value of $28.5 million. 60 years later, in 1968, the descendants of Chester and Clara Congdon found the mansion to no longer be practical to live in, since most of the space was not being used. They decided to donate the estate, including its grounds, to the University of Minnesota Duluth, and in 1979, it officially became a historic home. There was one caveat, though. Their last child, Elizabeth, would be permitted to reside there until she died. However, Elizabeth Congdon did not fall asleep peacefully in her old age and simply passed away. No, she would become the main character, the primary victim, in a case of murder so mysterious and bizarre that you would think the infamous murder mystery board game Clue had been created with her in mind. This crime would go down as one of the most notorious murders in the history of Minnesota, and which many still consider to be unsolved. On June 27, 1977, in the very early morning hours of a sticky hot summer, the heiress and her night nurse would become the victims of a home invasion and brutal murder. In the late hours of the night before, someone watched the mansion from the grounds below. Silent and patient, they waited until the last of the mansion's lights dimmed out. Velma, the night nurse, deep asleep, was shaken awake, alarmed by sounds she had never heard before in the old creaking house. Something did not feel right, and when she rushed to check in on Elizabeth, she was ambushed by someone who had been watching her, lurking in the dark. The perpetrator grabbed a candlestick on the nearby table and smashed it over Velma's head. They beat her with it until she lay caked with blood and dying on the floor. Vulnerable, weak, and now completely alone, Elizabeth was attacked in her bed, in the dark. The terrified, wealthy old heiress was smothered with her own pillow. Her assailant pushed the pillow down hard onto the old woman's face and waited until she didn't take another breath. Elizabeth Congdon's body was initially discovered by the day nurse, whose first shift started at daybreak. The woman was shocked to find that the 83-year-old heiress had been murdered in her bed. On the second-floor landing lay the body of her night nurse, 66-year-old Velma Piatella, who had been brutally beaten to death by what was later identified to be a candlestick. Velma had struggled with her assailant, which was evident by the strands of hair which were intertwined in her hands. There was a dark-colored nylon stocking that had been tied around her left wrist and a broken candlestick next to her dead body. The autopsy revealed that the night nurse's skull had been bludgeoned with an object. She died from her skull being fractured and the subsequent loss of blood from the trauma. There were bruises on Elizabeth's body, which the autopsy determined to have been made shortly before she was suffocated. There were marks left behind on her left wrist and little finger, which appeared to have been adorned with a watch and a ring that had been ripped off her corpse. She died at 2 a.m. that morning. Velma's vehicle, which was parked at the mansion the night before the murders, was found to be missing when law enforcement arrived at the scene that morning. At 8:30 a.m., at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, a maintenance worker located her keys in the trash, and the investigators found Velma Piatella's vehicle parked at short-term parking there a few hours later. The ticket for the parking lot was stamped for 6:35 a.m., but no fingerprints were lifted from the ticket. The only fingerprint found inside the vehicle was that of Velma's husband. However, a spot of blood which was tested to be type O was collected from the vehicle's floor. Elizabeth Congdon had never married, but in the 1930s she adopted 2 little girls, Jennifer and Marjorie, the latter of whom would become notorious for her multitude of criminal offenses. There was immediate suspicion toward Elizabeth's adopted daughter Marjorie and her husband Roger Caldwell, who some believed were entangled in a money murder conspiracy. It was well known that Marjorie, 44 years old at the time of her mother's death, was in massive debt, and her husband Roger, who was 43, was a steadily unemployed and sort of shady character. Marjorie Caldwell was set to become the sole beneficiary of Elizabeth Congdon's $8.2 million inheritance when her mother died. Marjorie had a history of spending money way beyond her $22,000 a year income from her present trust fund. Her $1 million trust fund had been cleaned out by the extravagant lifestyle she had attempted to portray. In 1977, the couple faced extreme amounts of debt. Having purchased a property in Colorado with the purpose of establishing a horse ranch, They were incapable of paying the mortgage and had subsequently went into foreclosure. They resided at the Holland House Hotel in Golden, Colorado until late June, when they returned to Duluth to attend Marjorie's mother's funeral. Earlier that year, the couple had also bought jewelry valued at $3,500 and treated themselves to a vacation at a resort in the mountains, which cost more than $5,000. What was the vacation for, I wonder, with Marjorie always scheming and Roger rarely having a job? The check that paid for the resort, however, was rejected, since the account from which Marjorie wrote it from had already been closed. Even though they were completely broke, Marjorie and Roger Caldwell behaved as if they were the opposite, and that same month spent more than $5,000 on a horse for Rick, Marjorie's 16-year-old son from her first marriage. In late May of 1977, Roger Caldwell had traveled to Duluth in a failed attempt to obtain from the Congdon's trustees $750,000 so they could purchase a ranch and $50,000 in loans to cover their debts. In this particular fraudulent ruse, Roger provided the trustee with letters from Marjorie's son Rick's doctors, which claimed that living the ranch life would be beneficial to Rick's health. According to one of the letters, it alleged that young Rick was suffering from cystic fibrosis, and he was part of an experimental drug testing group for the FDA. The couple had also at one point received a settlement in the amount of $74,000 for property that had been supposedly stolen from their own house. Initially, the check had been issued to Marjorie in addition to co-pays, whom she owed $51,000. But once it was received, the couple manipulated the insurance company to reissue it in Marjorie's name and a payee who was later determined to be a fictitious person. This made-up person then endorsed the entire check to Marjorie. On June 1st, 1977, Roger Caldwell conveyed to one of Marjorie's cousins, Thomas Congdon, a trustee, that he was afraid that they would get in trouble from this fraudulent check, in addition to the check given to the resort, which came from a closed account. He then requested $25,000 from Thomas to hire F. Lee Bailey as an attorney. Thomas Congdon was either easily manipulated or held genuine sympathy for the broke criminal couple because he provided the Holland House Hotel, where they had been living, with a check for $400, so they could continue to reside in their rooms. 19 days later, all three of their vehicles would be repossessed for lack of payment. They made an arrangement with the Golden State Bank that gave Marjorie's son Rick permission to use one of the vehicles for work if they agreed that he returned it to the bank's parking lot afterward each night. Isn't this the same son who allegedly suffered from cystic fibrosis? This couple had absolutely no scruples and used her son as a tool to retain money or services in whatever way they could. On June 22nd, Roger Caldwell and Rick used a credit card to purchase gas in the name of E.M. Congdon. It was discovered that they had run up over $750 on the card, which of course they never paid. The next day, the couple went to a pawn shop with some of their jewelry and got a check for $3,000 in return. Yet still, despite all of this financial strain, Marjorie proceeded to check out real estate to purchase and even attempted to purchase several different properties, but never followed through since they could not afford any payments. However, on the weekend before her wealthy mother and night nurse were savagely murdered, Marjorie had inquired with a real estate agent to show her around a place that was on the market for $1.3 million. On Friday, June 24th, only 3 days before the murders, her son Rick woke up at the Holland House Hotel to find a note that read how Roger and his mom would be checking out potential properties to buy that weekend, and to let him know that he could stay out later till 12:30 a.m. on both nights. Along with the note was $50 in cash, which he could use however he wished to take out girls and fill up the car. However, it was later revealed that the real estate agent never saw Roger at all that weekend, and Rick claimed to have not seen him at all between Wednesday the 22nd of June and Monday the 27th. What was strange is that Rick also alleged to have seen two people sleeping in his mother's room at 1:30 a.m. on the night of June 27th. On the morning of June 27th, the police in Colorado were notified by law enforcement in Duluth that Roger Caldwell was a suspect in the deaths of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatella. Immediately after, an investigation ensued. The murders were staged to appear as if they were the result of a home burglary gone awry. Investigators discovered that the glass in the upper section of a basement window had been shattered, and what appeared to be a footprint was left on the sofa that lay directly underneath the window. What was interesting about this piece of evidence, and that which was demonstrated during Roger Caldwell's trial, is that the circumference of the perpetrator's arm would have had to have been smaller than Roger's to fit this theory. The police officer's arm during the experiment, whose circumference was even smaller than Roger's, would not fit through the broken window in order to be able to unlatch the sash without dislodging a piece of glass. Different areas of the mansion were dusted for fingerprints, but the only ones the crime scene investigators found were on the candlestick. Unfortunately, they were tiny and of poor quality. Roger's fingerprints were eliminated as a possible source, and his fingerprints were not discovered in any area of the home. An analysis of hair found near Velma's body determined that they could have been microscopically similar to Roger's. Blood was collected from the bathroom and the stairwell and compared to Velma's, Elizabeth's, and Roger's. Both were determined to have come from someone with type O blood, and the blood found near Elizabeth's pillowcase matched one of the same enzymes as Roger's. Remember that this was before DNA testing was available, so they had very little physical evidence that a crime lab could prove that the specimen was Roger's hair or blood. At 9:30 a.m. that same morning, after the murders had taken place, the Golden State Bank witnessed Roger arriving to inform the loan officer that Rick ended up taking the vehicle earlier that morning than usual, since he had to be at his employer's by 8:30 a.m. Then in the afternoon, around 1:45, the desk clerk at the Holland House Hotel received a call from Roger, asking her to inform Marjorie that he was ready for her to pick him up, and that she already knew where he would be. The next morning at 7 a.m., Roger placed a call with the owner of the Wildwood Farms, where a horse of the Caldwells was being boarded. Roger informed the owner that his mother-in-law had been murdered and that their inheritance of around $10 million would be plenty to cover the bills, as well as buy the horse for Rick. When Roger went to the Golden State Bank to withdraw money for their trip to Duluth for Elizabeth's funeral, the manager, John Hannigan, testified that he appeared nervous and in a rush to leave. He also noted that there was a scratch on his mouth and one of his hands was swollen. Roger brushed off the concern, alleging that he had cut himself with his razor and the horse had stepped upon his hand. During his visit to the bank, Roger opened up a safety deposit box and put documents inside, one of which was a handwritten letter, crafted and signed by Marjorie, which promised him $2 million, which she would be due by the Congdon Trust upon the death of her mother Elizabeth. Roger, Marjorie, and her son Rick all landed at the Minneapolis airport that Tuesday, the 28th of June, and were greeted there by her attorney, David Arnold. D.A. Arnold testified that the defendant's eyebrow and lip had been cut. When the couple were interviewed by the investigators the following day, the police officers also noted the cut on his mouth and how his right hand was swollen. That same day, Roger Caldwell called his wife's riding instructor to let her know that she could go ahead with the purchase of Rick's horse. At this time, it was estimated that the type of horse they had planned on purchasing was between $40,000 and $75,000. That next evening, on the 30th, a handful of homicide investigators arrived at the Duluth Radisson Hotel to interview the couple. When they arrived, they were informed that they had already left the hotel that afternoon, to which the police requested permission to enter rooms 801 and 803 in which they had been staying. Within one of the rooms, an old suitcase was discovered with a baggage tag from their flight on June 28th, which was identified to be Roger's. Next to the suitcase were 2 boxes from a local clothing store, and inside lay a sales receipt from Host of Minneapolis, a gift shop inside the airport, but no fingerprints could be found on the receipt. On the 1st of July, investigators from the Duluth Police Department talked to 2 employees of the gift shop, and both provided police with eyewitness evidence that a man who was holding a wicker basket had bought a suede garment bag there in the early morning hours of June 27th. Their memory of the man, however, was hazy and conflicted, since one of them identified Roger in a photo array, but then she hesitated, later on claiming that she wasn't positive it was him since the man in the shop had worn glasses. The other employee identified someone else altogether. However, at his trial, both employees pointed out the defendant as the man with the wicker basket who bought the garment bag. As mentioned in a previous episode, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, yet there is so much importance placed upon it as a source of evidence for law enforcement, the prosecution, and the jury. It is also the number one reason individuals have been wrongfully convicted. On July 2nd, the Holland House Hotel desk clerk, Beth Heskins, informed the police that an envelope from the Radisson Duluth Hotel had arrived at the hotel on the 29th. Strangely, it was not only addressed to Roger Caldwell, but it was in his own handwriting. It was postmarked on June 27th. Investigators found within the letter, which was seized with a warrant, another envelope inside, small, folded, and which held a gold coin. This coin was one that had been stolen from the display case inside Elizabeth Congdon's bedroom. This time a fingerprint was lifted from the item and was found to match Roger Caldwell's. Then on July 5th, investigators located the Caldwells at Holiday Inn in Bloomington. With a search warrant in hand, they arrived at room 307, but none of them were there. Apparently, Roger Caldwell had fallen very sick that morning and had been checked into Methodist Hospital in St. Louis Park. Upon entry to the hotel room, the police spotted a wicker basket that closely resembled the basket that was reported to have been taken from Elizabeth's bedroom. When they searched the nightstand, they found in the drawer a blue plastic container with jewelry stuffed inside. Some of these jewels were known to have belonged to Elizabeth Congdon, including the watch and ring that had been snatched off her dead body. The other jewelry was identified as Marjorie's belongings. There were 17 additional pieces of jewelry that had been stolen from the Congdon estate that were never located. On July 6th at 12:20 a.m., the Duluth police force, along with local officers, arrived at the hospital to arrest Roger Caldwell for the double homicide of Elizabeth Congdon and Velma Piatella. On August 5th, 1977, Roger Caldwell was indicted by a grand jury on 2 charges of first-degree murder. During the trial, it was testified by the prosecution's fingerprint expert, Stephen Sedelasik, that the fingerprint had been lifted from the envelope containing the gold coin matched that of the print on record for the defendant's right thumb. It was also determined by the defense attorney's own expert that the fingerprint appeared to be that of Roger Caldwell's. Regarding the envelope, which was believed to have been written by the defendant, it was testified by the state's handwriting expert that the writing matched his, but that there were particular discrepancies between the envelope and the samples written by the defendant. The handwriting expert of the defense counsel testified that the writing on the envelope appeared to be written intentionally slow, indicative of a forgery. The 2 employees at the hotel gift shop claimed that they saw Roger Caldwell place the wicker basket inside the garment bag after he bought it. This was further corroborated by the clerk who sold him the bag, who testified that the garment bag in the hotel room was the same kind he had purchased. The man with the wicker basket was described as being between 45 and 47 years old, of average height, around 5'10", approximately 190 pounds, having short curly hair, lightly complected, wearing tinted glasses, and a short-sleeved yellow shirt. Oddly, the other witness described the man as having short sideburns, a big belly, white tinted glasses, blue jeans, and wearing an alpaca sweater. Even with these discrepancies in the description of the man, both employees identified Roger Caldwell as being the man they saw that morning in the shop. The defendant attempted to argue that their identification of him in the courtroom was unreliable, since the exact same photographs the police had shown them were some of the same pictures of him circulating in the media. The trial court dismissed this motion to strike the identification from the record. After a record-breaking long trial, he was found guilty of both murders and was sentenced to 2 life terms. His wife, Marjorie Caldwell, was charged with aiding, abetting, and conspiracy to murder. But strangely, she was found not guilty on all related charges. It was reported how Marjorie's skills at manipulation worked wonders on the jury. Unlike her husband, the jurors adored Marjorie, who welcomed the attention she gave them upon their arrival each morning, when she would flash a big smile and wink at them. It was noted how she even knitted in her defendant's seat and had a book on the table. When one of her defense counsel turned a year older, she even brought in a cake to celebrate and chatted up reporters and spectators in the courthouse during breaks. After 6 weeks of this game, she played with expertise. Marjorie had won over the jury, and some members even rushed up to her to give her a hug when the verdict read not guilty. After his wife was acquitted of all charges the next year, Roger Caldwell would request that a new trial be granted on the grounds of new evidence, violations of the discovery process by the prosecution, and misconduct. His request was denied. In his appellate case, he would raise these same issues in addition to several others. Specifically the first, the court abused its discretion by this denial to have a new trial based on the evidence that allegedly resulted in his wife's acquittal. Secondly, the post-conviction court also erred when it failed to order a new trial based on the violation of discovery made by the prosecution. Thirdly, the appellant raised the error that he was denied his constitutional rights to a fair trial based upon the statements made by the prosecution in their closing argument, in addition to the violation of a court order that had prevented particular testimony. The most pertinent of these errors raised was that the new evidence had been discovered, which was directly used to help his wife's case and successfully acquitted her of all charges. Apparently, this evidence was known to the prosecutor during his initial trial, but was not disclosed during the discovery process. For those of you who are not familiar with this legal term or process, it is the formal pretrial process where both the prosecution and the defense counsel are responsible for disclosing any and all relevant information, including eyewitnesses and evidence for the case that will be presented during the trial. Since the prosecution allegedly was aware of this evidence, which acquitted his wife during his own trial, yet failed to share it with the defense, this was a violation of the discovery rules. This evidence was highly relevant to his case, as it eliminated his fingerprint on the envelope that contained the gold coin. This, as a result, removed any known evidence that indicated that Roger Caldwell was in Duluth at the time of the women's deaths. Also, unbeknownst to the defendant and his counsel, the original fingerprint had deteriorated, and an enlargement of part of the print had been used to identify the defendant's fingerprints instead of the original print. However, the defense counsel did not specifically request the negative of the print, but they had directed the prosecution to present them with all evidence pertaining to the fingerprint, which they failed to do since they were never informed of its existence. A year later, when Marjorie Caldwell was in court, the original specimen of the print was almost invisible. It was revealed by the fingerprint expert for the prosecution, Sid Lasik, that during Rogers' trial, the fingerprint had already deteriorated, but he did not inform either side of this fact. Since the print was no longer able to be used for identification purposes, only the negative itself was sufficient enough evidence to be used. The negative was requested by the prosecutor by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and after an analysis of the negative, its enlargement, and the contact prints made off of it, another expert determined that the fingerprint was a very poor quality latent print, which was too difficult to identify whose fingerprint it was, but that it was for sure not of the appellant's Roger Caldwell. This expert also testified at Marjorie's trial that the enlargement that had been presented at Roger's trial had been mounted at an inaccurate angle, thus obscuring its representation. Two additional fingerprint experts further testified that the fingerprint on the envelope was not Roger Caldwell's. There was also testimony provided by a waitress at the Holland House Hotel, who claims she saw the appellant around 10 o'clock at night on June 26, 1977. This eyewitness was extremely important to his case, since it was nearly impossible that he could have been in Colorado at 10 p.m. and then traveled to Duluth to murder the women by 2 a.m. The defendant claimed that he was framed by the Congdon family, mainly based on the fact that the prosecution could not prove he had flown from Colorado to Duluth to commit the murders and then back again to Colorado. He also contended that theft of Elizabeth's jewelry was an asinine element in the case, since if the motive was to speed up the reception of Marjorie's inheritance, there was no sense in stealing jewelry or other items from her home. Roger, though, could not provide any evidence of this conspiracy to frame him for the double homicide during his trial. It was also later learned at Marjorie's trial how her cousin, the same Thomas Congdon, who had so graciously paid for their hotel residency in Colorado, had hired a private detective almost immediately after the murders to watch the movements of the Caldwells. During a recorded conversation between Thomas and Sergeant Green of the Duluth Police Department, it was conveyed by Thomas Congdon that he had hired private detectives to protect the Congdon family, and that since information can be bought, he had hired a detective named William Furman in Colorado to dig up what he could on them. Thomas Congdon also had someone watching over the Caldwells while they were in Duluth, who were participating in, quote-unquote, something I don't think sometimes you guys are allowed to do. Thomas testified that what he meant by this remark was in reference to electronic eavesdropping and buying information, but Roger believed that he had been framed by the hired detectives. He argued that this conversation held between Thomas Congdon and Sergeant Green was proof that the detectives had been hired to plan incriminating evidence like the garment bag and the jewelry in his hotel rooms. However, his defense counsel insisted that he had been given a copy of the police report and a summary of the conversation, just not a copy of the transcript. The court declared this conversation to not be new evidence, since his own counsel had it in their hands during his trial. There was also a transcript between an agent for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and two of the private detectives, which was sent to the prosecutor in April of 1978. In the conversation, it was conveyed by the detectives that they went to the Duluth Radisson Hotel late at night on June 28th, the day after the murders, and overheard the couple saying, and I quote, "I hope we can get away with this." However, the state, for one reason or another, concluded that they were lying and elected to not have them testify as witnesses. One of the detectives, William Furman, would testify at Marjorie's trial but refused to answer questions regarding the investigation of the Caldwells on the grounds of self-incrimination. He states that although he was hired by Thomas Congdon, he had never gone to Duluth or their Bloomington hotel as originally claimed, and that he had embellished parts of his report to justify the fees he charged Mr. Congdon. It was decided by the appellate court that the appellant has the constitutional right to a fair trial, and that is defined as having the jury being presented with true and correct evidence. Based on the fingerprint testimony of the state's expert, which has since been determined to be inaccurate, this warranted the appellant a new trial. Considering that the fingerprint evidence on the envelope and what was believed to be the defendant's handwriting on it was the only evidence presented by the prosecution to show that Roger Caldwell had been in Duluth during the time of the murder, this evidence directly led to his conviction. It is also critical to note how the prosecution could not locate any evidence that Roger Caldwell was a passenger on any airline on the dates in question. I am not sure whether his defense counsel brought up this fact during his criminal trial, but how could any jury member convict him of first-degree murder charges when the state cannot prove he was even in Minnesota at the time of the murders? That seems preposterous to me, unless there was proof of him or Marjorie using fake identities, which, given their long history of fraud, wouldn't be all that surprising if they did. With his first-degree murder charges overturned by the appellate court, Roger Caldwell now faced a new fate at the discretion of the courts. This time, the state realized that without the fingerprint evidence on the envelope he supposedly had sent himself, their case was weak. They determined that it was not worth the cost it would accrue to have another murder trial, and so the prosecution offered him a deal. If Roger would plead guilty to second-degree murder in the deaths of both women and sign a full confession, then he would be released from his earlier sentence of double life imprisonment and receive 5 years or time served. The prosecutor did this in the hopes that in return he would implicate Marjorie's involvement in the murders, but Roger never did. His full confession did not reveal any new information. In 1983, Roger Caldwell walked out of prison a free man in body, but not in soul. For whatever reason, he could not find peace once he was released, and he was haunted by perhaps what he did or what he knew, and that no one would give him a clean slate. In 1988, 5 years after he was freed on double murder charges, he took his own life. According to Westmoreland County Deputy Coroner Joseph Musgrove, Roger Caldwell, who was 54 at the time, slashed his own wrists and bled out alone, dying on the living room floor. There were 3 suicide letters found at the scene. One which shockingly confessed of his innocence, in which he claimed, and I quote, "I did not murder those women." As reported in the book Will to Murder, which covered the infamous murders, DNA evidence tested in 2003 allegedly proved that Roger Caldwell was inside the mansion the night of the murders. DNA taken from the infamous envelope was also tested and proved to be the saliva of Roger Caldwell. Nevertheless, this does not prove he committed the murders themselves. That his last words to the world before killing himself was the declaration of his innocence should not be taken lightly. We know at the end of the day that he was involved in the conspiracy, but to what extent? Only Roger knows, and dead men don't talk. Roger Caldwell would ultimately be penned for the brutal murders of the two elderly women, and nothing ever directly linked his wife Marjorie to the killings, despite the fact that the media and the public strongly suspected that she was the mastermind behind their deaths. It was believed by many that she motivated Roger to murder her own mother through the promise of sharing a significant portion of her inheritance. Conspiracies and crimes of arson, fraud, and even other murders would continue to follow Marjorie and those who crossed her path. After the trials, in which Roger Caldwell was convicted and Marjorie was acquitted of the murder conspiracy charges against her, she left her second husband, Roger, to rot in prison on his lonesome while she took off for North Dakota. In 1980, Wallace Hagen was still married to his first wife, who was ill and residing in a nursing home, when out of nowhere, she collapsed and became comatose, dying shortly after. Nurses there claimed to have seen Marjorie, who had known the couple for many years since their children had grown up together, give the woman something to eat from a jar. Not long after, she and the newly widowed Mr. Hagen would move in with one another. In 1982, she wed her third husband, Wallace Hagen, although it was not a legal marriage since she never even had the decency to divorce Roger Caldwell. Marjorie would be charged with bigamy a few months later, after she married Mr. Hagen. Then 2 years later, she was charged and convicted of arson for burning down the home in Minnesota she had lived in prior. Apparently, she had just sold the home, but had been the sole beneficiary of the insurance on the house, which, if she had not been caught, would have made her financially comfortable at least for a little while. Instead, she was convicted of arson and ended up being incarcerated for the crime for a little under 2 years. Then in 1990, she and husband number 3, Hagen, relocated to Ajo, Arizona. While living there, Marjorie was the prime suspect in several fires. In 1991, she was arrested after an eyewitness watched her as she attempted to burn her neighbor's house down. In 1992, during her criminal trial, she was convicted of attempted arson. Within that same year, she pleaded no contest to being charged with fire set at a storage yard in Ajo, which was believed to have been burned down for a fraudulent insurance claim. During the latter part of 1992, prior to being sentenced for multiple charges of arson, she was permitted 24 hours to assist in the transportation of her sick husband from Tucson to their home in Ajo, Arizona. However, within hours of being at home, Mr. Hagen was deceased. Marjorie claimed that they had made a suicide pact, most likely since he was in declining health and she was faced with a prison sentence, but Marjorie allegedly she couldn't kill herself in the end. She was subsequently charged with the murder of Wallace Hagen. In yet another twist of fate in Marjorie's favor, the prosecutor ended up dropping the charges. The investigators believed that she had killed her husband via gas poison, but the medical examiner determined that he had died from a drug overdose, so they didn't believe they had strong enough evidence to prove that he was murdered. 2 years later, Mr. Hagen's children from his previous marriage would allege in an article with the St. Paul Pioneer Press that they believed Marjorie was behind not only their father's death, but their mother's too. Between the years of 1993 and 2004, Marjorie was incarcerated for an arson conviction for 11 years. Since she was freed, Marjorie has called multiple senior residential communities in Tucson her home, and it was reported that she and her service canines frequently had issues with neighbors. Then she moved into her own home, but in 2007, she was charged with multiple felonies regarding her relationship with an older man in his 70s, of whom she had made herself his power of attorney. It was alleged that Marjorie had attempted to deposit his $11,181 inheritance into her own account after he passed. No cause of death was ever determined since Marjorie had him cremated before any red flags had been noticed. From this crime, she entered into a plea agreement for attempted forgery and was given 3 years of intensive probation. As her own health began to deteriorate, her lawyer requested that the probation be removed, at least to the extent that she could enter assisted living. As of 2017, it was noted how the then 84-year-old appeared to be in great health for her age, walking her dogs around without any assistance. She is no longer on probation and is free from any supervision. Although she had expected a fortune from her mother dying, she in fact was sued by 5 of her 7 children in 1979 who sought to disinherit Marjorie because they believed their own mother had been a component in the murder of their beloved grandmother. Both sides ended up settling out of court, and beginning in 1983, Marjorie was allotted $40,000 a year from the Congdon Trust. Hardly the $8.2 million she had planned on living in luxury for the rest of her years. Only one of her 7 children communicated with her ever since she had been tried for the murders of Elizabeth and Velma. The murders and subsequent trials of both Roger and Marjorie Caldwell would utterly absorb the lives of both the prosecutor John DeSanto and the head investigator Gary Waller. During the trials, which were relocated outside of Duluth due to the prominent family murders drawing in overwhelming amounts of pretrial publicity by the media, they would face 2 of the most esteemed defense attorneys in what would become the 2 longest criminal trials in Minnesota history. Roger Caldwell's trial would last a grueling 3 months, and his wife's Marjorie's would surpass that, lasting 3.5 months. Their lives and careers were so dominated by the case and the trials that they categorized their life as BC and AC, before Caldwell and after Caldwell. Only 3 years after the murder, the 27,000 square foot mansion and its grounds would open up to the public for tours. But the topic of the murders was forbidden prior to 2005. This is ironic since it is believed that at least a third of its tourists visit because of the horrendous murders that occurred under the roofs of its elegant mansion. What is even stranger is that the name Congdon is synonymous with the city of Duluth. Being one of its main founders, Chester Congdon was at the helm of much of its development, including a boulevard, park, and elementary school, in addition to an entire neighborhood that proudly bears the name Congdon. This is all overshadowed, though, by the murder house at 3300 London Road. Suspicion and obsession around the mysterious murders in Marjorie continue on to this day. There have been several books written about the case and her life, which crime follows wherever she treads. In 2015, a musical was even produced and was a sold-out sensation for years, performed at the History Theater in St. Paul. For the newer generations of the Congdons, the murders are still a source of pain for some members of the family. Thomas Congdon, who is the last grandson of Chester and Clara Congdon, spoke to the News Tribune of how although some healing has happened, no one forgives Marjorie. She is not welcome to come around, and to the best of his knowledge, no one has communicated with her in decades. It is difficult to know exactly what to dissect from a criminological point of view, since at the end of the day, no one except the perpetrators know what happened that fateful night at the Glensheen mansion. However, no one can doubt the fact that Marjorie was a master manipulator, a lifetime con artist, an arsonist, and most likely a murderer in at least one of these suspicious deaths that surrounded her. Allegedly, Marjorie was officially diagnosed as a sociopath at 10 years old, but the sources of this information were pretty random to call this a medical fact, although I have no doubt she would have been. She was involved in countless crimes of fraud, was convicted on several counts of arson, and in more than one murder, she was directly connected to the victim and was a very strong suspect in all of them. Marjorie Leroy Higgins successfully beat the system. She was highly intelligent and narcissist at the core of her character, and was witty and charming enough to get others to buy into her act. Yet she was a convicted felon at the end of the day because covering up arson was not her forte, and she was argumentative and unpleasant with her neighbors, which created a direct linkage between her and the crimes. In her older age, she became neglectful of the details, was not as much of an artist at manipulation, and got caught. Her behavior reminds me a bit of a previous female serial killer, Miss Lida Fly Trueblood, and that she was constantly ahead of everyone else in her plans and was willing to do whatever was necessary so that she did not have to make an honest living. It pains me to think of Marjorie enjoying such a long life, always finding the time and energy to cause harm to others, and her endless goal to please herself. Whatever happened that tragic night at the Glensheen mansion remains a mystery, but I personally think that justice has never been found in this case. These two older women were victims of greed, deceit, and darkness that had long reaped in the real perpetrator's heart. If Roger was the assailant, and many seem to believe he was the one who committed the act, and that it was Marjorie's wishes behind the murders, why before he took his own life would he declare his innocence? There are so many questions without any answers in this case. Guests and employees of the historic home have spoken of stories and experiences about the spirits of the murdered Elizabeth and Velma, which wander the estate grounds, never having found peace. There have been reports of lights flashing amidst the dark staircase where Velma was bludgeoned to death by a candlestick, and objects moving on their own. There is an unexplainable, otherworldly mist that some people have reported lingers in the library, which, interestingly, was Elizabeth Congdon's favorite room to spend time in. Guests have been struck with abrupt dizziness. There are even whispers of a dark, shadowy figure walking around the basement, and apparitions of two women looking out of Elizabeth's window late at night. If one is to believe in the possible connection between the restlessness of spirits and the truth never being revealed, then these two victims are lost within the mansion's walls, lingering endlessly throughout the 5 floors, in hopes that one day they will be granted true justice. What do you think? Do you think that Roger Caldwell committed the murders on Marjorie's request, on her demand, on her promise of money being shared from the inheritance? Or do you think there was some kind of conspiracy involved that just wanted to get rid of him and Marjorie from the Congdon estate for good, and they were a perfect scapegoat because they would have been willing to commit the crime? Like I said, there's so many questions around this case. It's a very compelling story to me, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Glensheen mansion murders. Until next time, be safe and watch out for shades of murder in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. A Lady Dogma Shades of Murder is created, written, researched, and edited by Lady Dogma. Music, courtesy of Pixabay by Ashwat Danielian.